Welcome to the interview. I'm George Dar. The Fair Justice System for Scotland Group, or the FJSS Group, is a grassroots-led organization, a legal charity based in West Lothian. The organization works towards creating greater equality and diversity in the Scottish justice system. I'm delighted to be joined by the CEO of Fair Justice System for Scotland, Mr. Silence Chuhuri. Silence, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate your time, sir. How are you today?
I'm very well, George. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome to Jambo Radio. So tell us, what is the Fair Justice System for Scotland Group trying to achieve?
I think, like you said in introduction there, George, what we are trying to achieve is greater equality and diversity in the Scottish justice system in terms of representation, representative employment, and representative appointments to the structures of the organizations and the institutions that make up the justice system in Scotland. And how do we do that? We try and work with those key institutions and organizations that make the justice system in Scotland. We started with the Scottish Government. We work with the Scottish Government through the Justice Department. We also work with organizations like the police in Scotland. We work with the courts and tribunal service. We work with the prison inspectorate. We also work with other community organizations that have an interest in the justice delivery.
So is there in the context of what's been the response, what's been the reaction and response to the work that you've been doing so far?
That's a very important question, George. I think the work that we do is mainly policy, changing policy and looking at how justice delivery can be done in a way that has a positive impact on the end user, if I can use that term. So when you're doing any work on that targets on policy, the natural response is resistance, or a defensive, sort of response from the establishment. It took a very long time, even for us to get through to the Scottish Government, for them to accept that the work that we are doing is important and to start working with us, at the level that we thought was helpful. It took a very long time. But I think, when you are doing something that you believe in, something that you think is very important, depending on how you're doing it, you always end up, making some inroads, making some breakthroughs. You always end up getting the sort of buy-in that you'll be looking for. So that's what we've seen, particularly from the government. I think they are now starting to realize that the work we are doing is very important, not just for ourselves, but for the government. If you look at their outcomes, their work plans, their action plans, especially the ones that are to do with the justice delivery in Scotland, there's a lot there that ties in with what we are doing. So I think that collaboration between us and the government through the Ministry of Justice and across the directorates in the ministry, I think that is shown that the work that we are doing is very important, and the government is starting to recognize that.
What were some of the issues that the justice system in Scotland was facing, specifically, or in particular, that prompted you, or it took you to try and look at this work and see how you can collaborate with the system in place? What were the challenges?
I think, speaking about myself, my personal lived experience. As a Black person living in Scotland, and my experience trying to enter the legal profession, for example, in Scotland, I think I found the legal profession in Scotland a very conservative profession. It's very closed up when it comes to people from BME communities entering the profession. This is why, if you look at the figures, the Scottish, the Law Society of Scotland, their membership is on the top end of 12,000 at the moment. And if you look at the percentages, the demographics, about 97.5% of the members of the Law Society, I'm talking of the legal professionals, they certify themselves as white. Only 2.5% is from the BME community. So that's a huge disparity, George. If you also look at our institution, the Scottish Parliament, for example, up to now, we do have 2 Asian MSPs, one of them who happens to be our Justice Secretary. But beyond that, we don't have an African yet who has been elected to the Scottish Parliament. But this is an institution which is now more than 20 years in existence. And if you look at the courts in Scotland, from the Justice of the Peace Court, the Sheriff Court, the High Court, right up to the Court of Session, you don't see any Black Africans within the Scottish bench, either as Justice of the Peace or sheriffs, whether temporary or permanent sheriffs, even in the High Court, the judges. We don't have a single Black African person within the justice system. Yes, we do have some Asians. Now we have a few Asian sheriffs and a few Asians who are working in prosecution. Again, if you go to the police force, the numbers are very low in terms of demographic uptake. And if you go to the prison service, the same. And also some of these agencies that are linked to the justice system in Scotland. If you look at the executive structures, I'm talking about the CEO, senior management, middle management. If you look at their boards, the chairman and the boards that govern these organizations, there is no representation for Black African people. And we have maybe 1 or 2 that now have people of Asian background, but that is all. We need the numbers to be up, because if you look at the diversity aspect of the Scottish society now, there is quite significant diversity. So we need that to be reflected, within the structures of the organizations that in the justice system in Scotland.
So let me ask you, Silas, with your experience and from what you just narrated there, your personal story, and you link it up with the representation. What I hear there is a lack of representation. Do you think that because of this lack of representation in the justice system in Scotland, gives room for injustices to be done on BME people?
To be honest, if you look at things like stop and search, for example, George, I remember, because I've known the Justice Secretary Hamza for going back when he was an MSP, just being elected. I've had a few events that I've met him. One of the events in Glasgow, I actually invited him because I was hosting this event and he was speaking. By that time, he was still just an MSP. And his experience of being stopped and searched, that's something he has always shared, very, very openly. But he's not the only one. There are so many other people from the Black African community. They've also been, disproportionately targeted. So when you have a system, George, that doesn't have representation within its structures, it's very difficult for that system to deliver equally across the demographics. And also, if you look at what happens in the courts, in the judicial process, the solicitors, most of them, they don't speak some of these minority languages that some of us, we speak. And most of us, we don't have English language as our first language. It's our second or maybe third language. So when you have that situation, and you're dealing with somebody who cannot speak your language, they don't understand your culture, they don't understand your background, they don't understand some of the issues. Because, when you, for example, people commit crime, right? There are a lot of factors that come in. When somebody find themselves going through the justice system, there are a number of factors that come to play. And sometimes it's always good to make sure that those factors are also put in consideration. And also, these people, they need that sort of level of support and connection with the process from a cultural perspective, from a linguistic perspective. Because if you have a solicitor who understands your situation, they are always going to represent you in a much better way than somebody who doesn't understand. So that's why we say if we have more diversity in the legal profession, that allows to bring in a much wider choice aspect to the legal service that our people can access, and that can also kind of increase the level of outcomes that we can get from the system, because here is a system that understands our situations, understands our background, understands our culture, connects with us in all these key areas. That can also help when it comes to the service outcomes. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you again, Silence. The other thing is, do you think some of the, perhaps, the stop and search things that, or people always, people, black and ethnic minority people are always linked to crimes that happens, and one of it as well has been some of the situations that we've actually lost people in police custody, which is not being very clear on what happened to the person. I'm talking about Sheikh Obayo recently, whom we lost, and the police is not quite clear on what happened to him. Do you think your work will give opportunity for such cases to be really pointed at, looked at completely from a cultural context and from a representative context?
Yeah, I think the issue of Sheikh Bayo, it was a very unfortunate, a very tragic sort of incident. Again, things like that, they do give our work a lot of impetus, to say perhaps if there was somebody who could understand someone like Sheku from a cultural perspective, when we speak, Black African people, when we speak, there's always this perception that we speak with a high-pitched voice, or sometimes we come across as being as if we are being maybe not violent, but just a little bit, maybe more enthusiastic in our expression. Maybe that can come across as if we are being in any other way expressing ourselves, maybe in a way that is more physically construed than it would otherwise be. But if there's somebody who can say, actually, when someone is talking like that, they don't mean anything. They are not being anything. They're just expressing themselves. This is just a very natural way of the African people to talk. That can also help, because I think there is always a misconception, you're at the end of the line, you hear them, oh, you don't have to shout. I mean, I've heard that a few times. You don't have to shout. And you say, no, I'm not shouting. I'm just talking. I'm just speaking normally. But because we speak in a different way, we express ourselves in a different way, that can be misunderstood. But if there's somebody who can understand, to say, you know what, this is just a natural way, this is a very normal way of the way we talk, that could help as well.
Yeah. So in terms of the work of the FJSS, I am going to move on to the book launch, because I think it's very important, because that context links very well with the work that you're doing, because there are historical facts. I've not read the book yet because I'm still waiting for my copy, which you need to send through.
You'll definitely get yours. It's on its way.
Yeah, but so tell us about the book.
Yeah, like we rightly said, George, we always try and connect the work that we are doing today with some of the historical things that have happened in the past. For example, we say inequality that we face today, racial discrimination that we face today, All these things like general disproportionate inequality that we face. These things that did not just happen overnight. We did not just wake up today with some sections of the society that have racial prejudice towards people of different color. It didn't just happen like that. How did it happen? Maybe the foundation was laid down many years ago through those issues like the slave trade, which was purely, a race dynamic. Here was one race on one end of the spectrum, the white race, and they viewed the black race as probably an inferior race that wasn't, supposed to be treated equally. That's why the black people were enslaved, because they were seen as they could not be anything but slaves to the white people. So we see that today because the slave trade had such a lasting impact. It had such a long-term impact on the mentality, on the thinking behind some of these prejudices that we deal with today. So we try to connect that to say, you know what, let's go back maybe a few hundred years and look at what happened then. How did it happen? And how does it influence what happens today? So this is why we launched the book. It's a history book. Although it's focused on West Lothian, it's called the West Lothian Connection. It connects West Lothian as a place to the slave trade, but there are some very prominent people from West Lothian who were involved in the slave trade. There are some very prominent places in West Lothian that are connected to the slave trade. So this book is not talking about anything you have never heard about, George. It's talking about issues you already know, but it's just putting a little bit more sort of perspective into those issues. It's emphasizing those issues, probably amplifying them a little bit more than we have heard them before. So it's a book which has been very well received since the launch on the 29th of October. Most people who have read the book, they think it's a fairly informative book that could be a very useful learning resource, especially to school children, not just in West Lothian, but perhaps beyond West Lothian.
To perhaps beyond West Lothian. In terms of your findings for this book, were there, what sort of linkage do you West Lothian has with the slave trade?
Oh, for example, like 5, maybe 6 of the most prominent, most high-profile slave owners are from West Lothian. I have people like John Newland. I'm sure if you've heard in Bathgate, they do what they call the John Newland celebration.
Yeah.
This is people of Bathgate, some of them coming together to celebrate John Newland as one of their, most prominent, most eminent persons. But, from people like me and other people who understand the history a little bit more, they will be a little bit uncomfortable to celebrate somebody like John Newland because he was a slave owner. And one of the most remarkable things that John Newland did, he left some money that was used to set up one of the schools in Bathgate, Bathgate Academy. So this is why he celebrated. There are some places which are named after him. There's a medical center which is named after him. So the reason why these things were being done in honor of his name is to recognize what he did for the community. But I think what people didn't do was to think a little bit beyond those seemingly innocent, philanthropic exploits of John Newland, and just to think about where did he get the money that he used. The money was got from selling slaves. So that's what we are trying to highlight. We have people like Stephen Mitchell. He was from Linlithgow, but he's the one who also made a lot of money from tobacco, and then the money from the tobacco was also used to buy some slaves. And Stephen Mitchell, he left some money to set up the Mitchell Library in Glasgow. Although he's from West Lothian, but for some reason, he ended up in Glasgow setting up one of the biggest reference libraries in Europe. The Mitchell, I'm sure, George, you would have gone into the Mitchell Library at one point, So we have people like, Archibald Dalzell. He came from Kirkliston. He owned 2 of the largest ships that were used to transport slaves from West West Africa, where people like George Moncrief, people like, there are quite a lot of them. So they are all from West Lothian. And we are just trying to highlight that West Lothian has a very, very strong and prominent connection to the slave trade.
Yeah, given the fact that we've just come out of Black History Month celebrations, which your book was also launched as part of that festivity. I'm thinking, do you think this book would be instrumental in the curriculums of perhaps education for because there is quite a big move now to see how these historical facts should be corrected, in the history, especially in this country, Scotland and the UK, well, Scotland in particular, where we are. So, do you think such literature can help the curriculums or the understanding of the connection that Black Africans and Caribbean people have to this?
Definitely, George. Definitely, that's a very important question. I think one of the main reasons why we produced the book was so that it could be used as a learning resource in the schools. Because for us, if the book doesn't find its way into the schools in West Lothian, that would not be a very good outcome. I think the history in the book would be of immense benefit to some of the school children in the schools in West Lothian, but not just the children, even the adults, their parents. Although the children are having an opportunity to learn about this at an early age, which probably their parents never had, that would be very good even for the parents as well to read the book together with their children. They can also learn a thing or two. Because a lot of people, they don't know some of these things, like the people from West Lothian who were involved in the slave trade, some of the places, the buildings in West Lothian that have links to the slave trade. Some of the adult people in West Lothian, they don't know about this. So these are some of the things that they could benefit also by reading the book.
That's excellent. That's right. So there's I'm going back to the fair justice system for Scotland Group, the formation and all of. How long have you been doing the work for?
We started in 2012, so it has been going on for about 8 years now. But like we said in the beginning of our conversation, when you start something new, the system takes quite a long time to take it up, to absorb it. So I think most of the formative years of the organization were just spent trying to make a case for this kind of work, to say this is work that is necessary, this is work that is important, this is work that needs to be done, this is work that needs to be supported, this is the work that needs to be collaborated with at the highest possible level. We are talking from the government, from the local authorities, from the Scottish Parliament, for example, and all these other institutions that are linked to the justice system. And I think the other thing, George, that we have made very clear is to make sure that we are specific. A lot of organizations, they do a lot of things, but they will be covering quite a lot of things. But we said, we want to be specific to the justice system, because that area alone, it's a massive area, George. It's a huge scope of work. So I think we are very pleased that we made that choice to be specific and to focus on the justice system, because this has allowed us to come up with this model of work, which has some very clear objectives and which could also produce some very clear outcomes.
Do you think the community also needs, perhaps people within the Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities, should have some level of education about the justice system as well? Apart from you trying to get representation in the system, you're trying to get the system to understand it in the work that you do at FJSS. But should the community also has a responsibility to understand the justice system?
Definitely, George. That's a very, very important question again. I think that is perhaps the most important piece of our work. Because, George, even if we get the equality and the diversity that we think we need within the system. But as long as the community doesn't understand how the system works, how to engage with the system, and how to access the system, and how to make the system work for the community, I think there will still be some problems with justice delivery. So we need our people to understand how justice works, and that's part of the work that we do. For example, we are now working with, we've always worked with members of parliament, but I think as of August, we started a very, very specific, parliamentary surgery with the local MP here for Livingstone, Hannah Patel. She's one of the MPs who has always been very, very vocal about inclusion within our institutions, within our democracy. So Hannah is running a joint surgery with us, and this one is specifically targeted to BME communities, because the issues that BME communities face, George, they are unique to our communities. Yeah.
The issues that we face is absolutely unique. You say that those some of those challenges. What sort of channels do you think? I know you mentioned the local member of Scottish Parliament in Livingston is helping, working with you to get this to the grassroots. And again, as I introduced them, you are a grassroots-led organization. I'm just trying to understand, the level of work that needs to be done at the level of the community, for the community to have a complete, total understanding and take seriously that, listen, you need to understand the justice system, because there are people breaking laws ignorantly or innocently, and there are people behaving illegally, and those things are going to pass through some education process. What do you think we should be doing to achieve that silence?
Yeah, I think before the COVID-19 lockdown came into place, I think we had started some of these community engagement, community stakeholder events that we were doing. We would bring together community organizations on one end, and we would choose maybe one arm of the justice system to engage with those communities. For example, the Home Office is another organization which our communities has always had challenges dealing with. But I think we're trying to break those barriers to the extent that we had started running those stakeholder community events with the Home Office, which were very popular and well attended. Again, that's a way of trying and bridge the gap between the system and the community. And then at the moment, what we are trying to do as well, for example, here in West Lothian, we are trying to work with the local councillors, to make sure they are the ones who are in the wards, they represent the communities. And we're trying to break down, to the very micro level demographic aspect of the community. And part of that is to make sure that we make the council aware that when they are making their work plans, their development plans, and their budgets, they need also to be aware of the demographic representation, the ratio, the ratio aspect of the community here in West Lothian, so that when they plan their outcomes, their objectives, development objectives, they also have a positive impact on the community. And at the same time, also try to engage the community to make sure they give us their feedback. What do they think about the current service level? What do they think could be done to improve what the council is doing for the community so that the outcomes can be improved? And then perhaps the last point is that as part of the work that we do as well, we have started work now with organizations that are linked to the Scottish government. For example, the public appointments bodies that look into appointing people to public agencies of the Scottish government. So what we do, we're running some workshops with our communities to make sure they understand some of these positions that are in these organizations that do very, very important work. They deliver very, very important policy objectives on behalf of the government and on behalf of themselves. But our communities, they need to understand that for them to be able to engage with these organizations or to get to the point of being appointed to the boards of these organizations, what does it take? How can we prepare them? And we are also looking from the other side with the public appointments team, for example, who holding meetings. We want them to know that the criteria that has been in place for many years, when you apply for this position, there are set criteria and rules that determine whether you are the right kind of candidate. Some of that criteria was set a long time ago, George. I think it's about time that maybe those things are revisited to make the process more inclusive so that when people apply for these positions, they are not excluded by the system itself. We need a system that is more proactively inclusive so that everybody can also meet the criteria, if I can use that word. And then the other thing we are also doing is holding some Zoom meetings,
Yeah.
with people, providing them general career guidance. How can they improve their applications? How can they improve their CVs, the presentation, and how can they improve their interview skills? When you go for an interview, how do you present yourself as a candidate? How do you undertake the interview process competently and in a way that projects you as a credible sort of candidate? So those are some of the things that we're doing.
Wow, Silas, thank you so much. It's really wonderful to have an insight of the fair justice system, Scotland Group, or FJSS Group. What does it take, for someone like you to embark in this thing? It's quite a lot to do there. I know you've said at the beginning there, you talked about your experience, your story, and obviously everyone can link that with why you're doing the work that you're doing, but it must be challenging.
Oh yes, George. I mean, it's never easy, but I think, like I said, sometimes you have to have that level of determination, George, to say, you know what, for the system to work for us, what level of determination should we have to engage that system and make that system aware? It's part of that process, George, of making the system aware of the issues, the challenges that we deal with. And then you realize that as an individual, if I go to the system as a person, the system may not have a lot of time for me. But when you create a platform that people like you, people like me, we can come together and create this platform that we can then use to engage constructively with the system. I think the system is always bound to, although they may take time, but eventually the system will engage with that sort of platform. I think that's what we are seeing with FJSS.
And what are you envisaging to be? How do you envisage the justice system in Scotland in perhaps in the next 5-10 years?
I think, again, it's a very timely question because right now, what we are doing now with the Scottish government through this piece of work that we are doing, working together on policy development. I mean, we are coming to the end of the parliament, George. There are elections next year, for example. There are some milestones that are coming out of circulation. They will need to come up with new things. Whether the same government will be elected, the SNP, or maybe another party, we don't know. But in terms of the SNP, they've had their milestones for the last 5 years. They'll be looking at maybe bringing in new things based on the experience of what is happening at the moment. I mean, on the back of what is going on with the Black Lives Matter protests, with the George Floyd thing that reinvigorated the debate around racial equality. I mean, the government is very keen now to bring in input from BAME communities. That's why they've engaged our organization as a natural go-to organization, which has a specific focus on the justice system. So what we can foresee coming out of this very new initiative, where the government has recognized that they don't have that sort of BME presence within their structures, but what they can do on day one is to tap into BME expertise, like what they're getting from us. I think the outcome, George, is pretty much the same. It's either you have somebody like this, or you can have input from somebody like this. I think one way or another, we have the same impact. So we can foresee some very, very positive outcomes within the next maybe action plan, maybe whether it's a 5-year action plan. I know they were talking about 2030, but perhaps we can look milestones that are earlier than that. We can have some very positive outcomes based on this new collaborative approach that we are providing input into.
Silence Chuhuri, CEO of Fair Justice System for Scotland Group. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to Jambo Radio. Really appreciate your time, sir, and wonderful work that you're doing. And we're right behind you.
Thank you so much, George, for having me. I really appreciate the work you're doing as well there, providing a voice to our community and providing us a platform where we can come to talk about this work. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
On the World Wide Web, on your mobile phone, and on all social media platforms. Jambo Radio.